Dr. Nereida Carrasco, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about trauma resilience for young adults. This is, if you have a question, feel free to just go ahead and ask it. You can ask it in the chat box, but I know at the end, any question that you might have, I'm going to try my best to answer every single question. Please be mindful, I'm not the owner of all the answers to everyone's questions. So if I don't have an answer for your question, I will make sure to find an answer for it. So we'll go ahead and just get started. I might have to move this up a little bit. And I think the arrow's here. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about a lot of different types of trauma. And the only reason why is because a lot of people lump everything together. And I want you all to start understanding how there's different parts to trauma. And this is a large spectrum. And so the more that you're able to really start looking at it from that perspective, it helps us be able to understand how we can be resilient and how we can work on ourselves when things have happened to us. So the first thing is always talking about what we call adverse childhood experiences. For short, it's usually called ACEs. You'll find that a lot of places will call it an ACE. And so we're just going to go through them so that everyone kind of understands them. They get lumped into these little categories. So we have what's called family hardships, and family hardships are considered like when you have a household member that has mental illness. So if you grew up in a household where somebody was depressed, anxious, or nervous, maybe had PTSD or other types of mental health disorders like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anything like that. And it's any family member that lives in that household that might be experiencing this mental illness. That's considered under family hardships. Also, anybody who might be using substances, or a family member, a brother, a sister, cousin who lives in that household with you that might be using or misusing, like for example, some people are like, oh, I'm only using alcohol, but that's still considered a substance. So just be very mindful of that falls under that category. And also if your parents or if in that household there was parental separation or divorce, maybe two families are now living together because of divorce or because two families separated, that's considered a family hardship. And then also if your family member was ever incarcerated. This means that if you're ever experienced a family member who was ever arrested and or was incarcerated for a long period of time, or even a short period, so it could have been a 1 or 2 days, but that still all classifies under that one section. The other parts is that there's forms of abuse. It could be physical abuse, that's maybe when someone's hitting you or hurting you. It could be sexual abuse, when somebody's touching you in places you don't want to be touched. And it could be emotional or psychological abuse. That means when we use words to intimidate or to harm someone. That means we tell them that, you know, there's something wrong about them, or we just continue to tell them that, you know, there's things that are negative about them. The other part is physical neglect. This one's one that a lot of people don't report as often, and that one is actually when individuals kind of are not seen in their house. So you know, they could go days without their family members knowing whether they took showers, whether they ate, you know, could have been left home alone for a really long time, and that all falls under that physical neglect part. The other part is there's also other forms of violence that can happen. There could be a mother treated violently or a father treated violently. And then there can also be intimate partner violence. All of this combined, if you've experienced any one of these things before the age of 18, you are considered to have had experience an adverse childhood experience. So you have one ACE. Or depending on if you had a couple, you might have a couple more. And so we're going to go through that, but I wanted everyone to understand this as we move on to the other part of us talking about different types of traumas. So the next part is we have the spectrum of emotional and psychological trauma. I know that I'm going to give you a lot of information about trauma at the beginning, and it's going to hopefully make a little bit of sense as we're going through it. But if you have questions, feel free to let me know, and I will check the chat box to make sure if there is any questions that are coming up for people as we're going through this. I just have to find the chat box first. There it is. Okay. I don't think that there's any questions so far, so I'll continue to move on. So the other thing about this part of emotional psychological trauma is it is a spectrum. You might have experienced a little bit of each one of these things, or you might have family members that have experienced a little bit of each one of these things. So be mindful about that as you're going through it, because it might click as might not even click right now, it might click a little later. So acute trauma is when someone experiences only one type of trauma. That means they don't experience anything else. An example of this might be like someone experienced, you know, an earthquake. That's the only thing that's ever happened to them. Nothing else has ever happened, and they're able to work through that that trauma, and they get better, right? And the next one would be chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is something that you might be going through on a day-to-day basis. So it could be, you know, some form of abuse. It could be even some form of stress that, you know, you actually feel it as a trauma. And so it's something that happens on an everyday basis. I always give the example, you know, as a kid, you know, chronic trauma might look like, you know, if you are not, if you don't get along with your teacher, right? And that teacher consistently always doesn't give you the right information, or you don't feel like you're connecting well and you feel like they put you down, right? And you go through the whole school semester like this, you might be experiencing what would be considered as chronic trauma, which is something that happens on a daily basis versus something that just happens once. So chronic trauma can accumulate, and then what you might find is you might find that you have complex trauma. And complex trauma is when you have one of those ACEs events that we kind of talked about in the previous slide, and now you have other stuff that's happening. So that compounded together actually can create what we call as complex trauma, which means that you're going to feel a whole bunch of different types of symptoms. You're going to feel nervous. You might feel like you're numb, like maybe you just kind of go off into, I call it the Hawaiian vacation. It's kind of when people are staring off into other places and they're just not paying attention. You can also feel like really jittery. You can also get really angry. So these are all some of the symptoms you might feel when traumas kind of collide together, and you might be experiencing some type of complex trauma, which means you've had a couple of traumatic events that are kind of layered now together. The next one is toxic stress. Toxic stress is a little different. Toxic stress might look like in a setting. It might be in that, you know that, there's a bully at school, and every single day you got to go see that bully, right? That might create toxic stress. It's stressful to know you have a bully. Does it mean that you're going to be okay? Yes, it does, but it's a constant stress for you to know whether that bully is there or not. So I just remind everyone, toxic stress is a little bit different because it actually is one stressful event that maybe you're going through in one particular point in your life. So I always give the example, like once I had a really not so nice boss, and I had to keep going to work, and they were just not the nicest, but I stayed in that situation for a little longer. So I just remind everyone about that toxic stress looks a little bit different. Secondary trauma might be something where you might actually have had this happen to you. Secondary trauma is, I have a friend, that friend had something really bad happen to them, and now they shared it with me, and now I feel like I have their stress, right? A very simple example of it is, if you've ever had a friend, if they broke their ankle, right? And they come and they tell you, oh my God, let me tell you what happened, how I broke my ankle. I fell forward, and this is what I did, and this is what I said, and this is how it happened. And then by the end of it, you now feel like, oh my God, I might be able to break my ankle, right? It doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen, but that's what secondary trauma does. And so sometimes, we're really good at being a really good collective to each other and making sure that we are all taking care of each other, but sometimes that secondary trauma can also be very impactful for us. So be mindful of the stories you are able to take and the ones you can't. And I always remind everyone, sometimes these secondary traumas are also involving ACEs, like when people share with you whether they've ever experienced some form of violence, that can take a toll on you as well, and we call that secondary trauma. Vicarious trauma is usually where this might be like for those of us who work in social work or in other professions that work with people. Vicarious trauma is when people share with us their stories of, you know, forms of violence or oppression or racism, sexism, whatever it is that's happening for them in their lives, and how we interpret it. And then we can also start feeling some of the symptoms of trauma. So we really want to make sure people are mindful of these different things. And then also reminding everyone that there's something called compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is actually when you've been around enough people that have trauma, you are more likely to not want to deal with it at one point, and really start to not be compassionate towards people when they share their stories. So someone could be crying with you and sharing their story, and you're just going to sit there and not have any reaction because you're just kind of at a place where you've just kind of, you're done with listening to people's stories. One thing we remind everyone about vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue is you really want to make sure that you're checking in with yourself. And this is where we start talking about resilience, is you really have to be mindful of what you can absorb and what you can't. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we kind of go through, but I just wanted to make sure to touch that topic. We also have insidious trauma. This could be any type of racism, sexism, ableism. I call them all the isms, but it's anything that is part of our society, right? So for example, your experience in this world might be an insidious trauma. There might be things that have happened to you along your growth and along your journey that might fit that criteria, where you feel someone was discriminatory towards you and that has impacted you across your life. I want to make sure that people acknowledge that that piece. And then there's also historical trauma. When we talk about slavery, the Holocaust, any big historical event that has ever impacted a society can be traumatic for certain people. As we're going through, I remind everyone that this is a spectrum, which means that not everyone feels these traumatic events in that order. And not everyone's going to feel it with the same intensity as others. So you really want to just be mindful of what that looks like for you and how you are able to maneuver those pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other slide so that you guys can start. And I'll stop here just to make sure if there's any questions that you might have about this. I don't see any questions, so I think it's okay to move on. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm going to move the little camera up a little bit. Went too far. All right. So the next thing, now that we've talked about all these types of trauma, I did want, okay. Oops, hit the thing too much. Okay, I did want to talk to you guys a little bit about the prevalence of ACEs, because sometimes when we go through talking about different types of trauma, sometimes people are sitting there and are really scared because they're like, oh my God, I've had all these things happen. And I just want to make sure that all of you are aware that about 22% of the United States, that means that about every 2 out of 10 people in the US, right, have experienced some form of trauma, right? And about 16% live in California, right? 16% of Californians have experienced one or more forms of trauma or ACEs. And in LA County, which means it's the cities that we all live in, it's about 16.7%. So this means that across the board, you should know this, is that most people have experienced some type of trauma. So we're all traumatized in different ways, and that's okay, because we're gonna find ways we're gonna get through this. So the other thing I should also just wanna make sure everyone knows is when you've experienced some form of adverse childhood experience, and when you experience 6 or more of them, you actually can reduce your life by 20 years. Because what research has found is that when trauma goes unhealed, and when people don't want to work on their trauma, they tend to actually experience increases in a couple things. They increase in poor social connections, which means that they don't have the healthiest of relationships with people. They also tend to have more mental illness. They tend to be more violent or be more aggressive. And then they tend to have a couple of other health conditions like heart disease, cancer, and other non-communicable diseases that they tend to engage in, only because once again we go back to this part, is when you're not healing, you're not talking about things, you tend to do things that are not the healthiest. And so sometimes, you know, individuals have a higher increased risk of using substances, whether that's alcohol or whether that's other substances like marijuana. It could also be opioids like pills. It could be cocaine, all sorts of different things. So the other thing is, what people forget to look at is also the emotional part, which is that most people who have experienced an adverse childhood experience also have a higher likelihood of becoming a victim of violence. And so when we start looking at this, we really want you to be aware that you actually have all the tools that you need to be able to change all these things and not continue to be these statistics. And that actually comes from resilience. Really being able to acknowledge that something has happened to you, but taking the steps to be able to feel better is a step in the right direction. So I know we're talking a lot about a lot of things, but I really want you all to understand that these are all spectrums, right? And the other spectrum is also if you've experienced the impact of violence, whether that's through death, like you've had somebody pass away, whether that's that you were physically injured, or that you've had some type of psychological trauma. These are all also the immediate effects of violence. And what we know is that when we have these immediate effects of violence, we also find that that's immediate, but as time goes by, this actually creates lasting effects. And those lasting effects mean that there's going to be physical disability in that household, whether that means that that person was injured and they're no longer able to function the way that they used to, or there's also going to be changes in that family structure. There's also problems where there might be employment or educational changes, like people not going to college or people choosing to work. Maybe that's something that's needed, but sometimes that comes from an immediate effect of violence. And so we really want everyone to be mindful that, you know, the impact of all these different things can feel a little overwhelming, and they can also lead to all sorts of different things as you grow and as you move on. So one of the other parts is also understanding is the household income challenges. Sometimes households, because of all this violence and trauma, they tend to not have everything that other households have. And so it's really mindful, especially as you're moving on to college, to understand that these are things that are going to impact you as you're growing. And so, you know, any type of these lasting effects that you might see in your life will take a toll, depending on how you view it and how you look at it. So, you know, I remind everyone these lasting effects can be changed. You yourself, as you're going on your journey of, you know, entering, you know, some form of higher education, will, you know, start looking at these things in a different way. But I really want you to understand that there's also things that will impact you in different ways as you're growing. So the other thing is also to understand is some of these impacts actually are things you can actually change by taking steps. So lastly, the multi-generational effects that you might feel when you look at your community and you look at your family and you look at everything around you might look a little bit like these things where, you know, there's violent norms where, you know, we tend to interact in maybe not the nicest of ways to each other. We have fear-based norms, which means that we tend to freak out more than we tend to be like, okay, we're going to figure out the situation, we're going to find a solution to this. And also epigenetic effects. So a lot of people grow up thinking that, oh my gosh, because I've experienced all these different things, or because my parents experienced all these different things, that means that there's something wrong with me, or that I myself am, you know, not going to be able to get to where I need to be. And I remind everyone that that's actually not the case, because similar to the way that all all the trauma and different things have happened, you are also able to learn about resilience and learn how to change all these different traumatic events for yourself. So you are able to change these multi-generational effects, the lasting effects, and even the immediate effects of violence and trauma. And we really want you to understand that piece as you're going through this. And I always tell people, why do you need to understand trauma and how you are resilient? And I'll explain why. So I'm a doctor of social work, which means that I always tell people I've probably been in school longer than most people. And when I was first going off to college, I came from a single parent household, and there was a lot of different things that happened. And one of the things that I learned as I was going through college is that there's ways that you have learned to adapt to the situations that happened to you when you were younger. And there's ways that you learn to adapt to the situations as you're growing up. And the more you learn that adaptation is actually a good thing, and it's the way you stay safe and the way you maneuver the world, the more you're actually able to create resilience. But that actually comes from also learning and doing some work for yourself. And some of that work actually comes from learning how to develop resilience. And what this really means is you have to learn, how do you adapt to things? So am I a person that learns from the experience? And so I'll give you a situation. I had a very interesting roommate, and I remember when I dormed at a college, my roommate would, sit and cry. And so sometimes I'd walk in and I'd be like, "Are you okay?" And she'd be like, "I'm not crying." And then I'd be like, "It seemed like she was, but I'm not sure." And so then, like, it took me a little while to understand that, like, oh, you know what? While my adaptation is that, you ask people maybe how they're doing, like, her adaptation was she just needed to cry. So resilience really means like meeting yourself in the feeling and meeting yourself in what you need. And so I didn't quite understand that when I was dorming with her. I'm coming from where I come, I was just like, she's crazy, but she wasn't. That was her way of maneuvering these very new situations of being in college and being in a new setting. So I just remind everyone, like, your resilience is not going to be somebody else's resilience, but the more you learn to build adaptation and learn that, hey, just because this person is doing that doesn't mean I have to do it. It helps you be able to heal and be able to grow. The other thing is remaining hopeful. So you really have to start looking at things from the positive instead of a negative. That's actually one of the ways you actually do develop resilience, is by really looking at what's working, right? So if you've had all these things happen in your life, you really have to adapt your thinking. Or if someone's, you've grown up with somebody telling you that you're not the nicest or the greatest of people, you have to rechange that thinking and actually start telling yourself, like, I am a good person, I am good at what I'm doing, and I'm gonna excel at this. And so you really have to start building that hopefulness for you, because that's actually something that's gonna help you along the way. The other thing is you should always be able to understand that you need to take care of yourself. And what that means is not just taking a shower every day. It really means trying to figure out who you are as a person and what you need to develop as you're going to be able to be the healthiest person that you can be, right? And the next part of building resilience also means reaching out for support. Get connected and be proactive. I remember I got lucky enough that when I was going to college, I found other people that had already experienced college, because I came from, a home where someone had not gone to college. And so it made it that much harder sometimes to be able to get through things, because someone did not understand that piece. And so I really just want people to be mindful of that part, is, really understanding like what that looks like. And so you really want to make sure like what that looks like in your household, and also reaching out for support in order to be able to be connected to other people. And what does your support system look like? I got lucky enough that, I found friends while I was going to school that were really great people, and we were able to really like work together and learn from each other. But that's not the case for everyone. So, you know, find the quality people that you can get along with, and that are going to be supportive of whatever it is that you're doing. If someone tells you that your dream is too big, or like you shouldn't be doing that, unless it's something that's not the greatest, there might not be that support system, and that's okay. But you want to make sure that you have people in your corner that, you know, are going to tell you, man, that's a great idea. I can't believe you're doing that. And so that's always the healthiest part. The other part is also like learning to experience your feelings. Like I said, my roommate would cry. That was okay for her. Might have not been okay for me, but it was okay for her. So I want to make sure that you understand that you have to experience the feelings of the things that are going on. Sometimes that doesn't feel comfortable, but it's something that might be needed. You want to make sure that you make every day meaningful, which means, you know, if you need to, start a thankful jar, you know, put little notes as to what you're thankful for or what went well. And kind of keep that, because sometimes you're going to need to go into that jar to pull that little note out that, you know, is going to bring you some type of joy or some type of understanding that you're working and you're doing well. The other thing is also is you do need to sit and experience anger, grief, and pain. I do not mean that this means that you can punch the wall, because that's not what this means. What this means is that when you're feeling sad or hurt or annoyed or angry or frustrated, you have to learn to just sit with it, and learn what that feels like, because one of the things is that we tend to quickly try to get into another place, and we forget that sometimes we really have to just sit and listen and own the feeling that we're feeling, so that we can find a solution to whatever it is that's happening. So be very mindful of what that looks like, and just how everything is feeling for you as you're going. The next thing about taking care of yourself is you really, when people are being told to take care of themselves, I don't know about you, but I would always think like, oh man, that just means take a shower, and it doesn't. What it means is that it means you got to focus on who you are and what your needs and what your feelings are. That means that if I have a need, like I'm hungry, I need to honor that need, and I need to find food, right? If I feel sad about something, I'm allowed to tell people, you know what, I'm not feeling the greatest right now. I probably need, you know, to feel a little better about something. So I just remind everyone about those different things, so that people are knowledgeable that this is not about making sure you're taking a shower or brushing your teeth. This is about the internal work that comes through you, about you, and how you're going to be able to maneuver. The other thing is you want to get involved in a favorite activity or hobby. So you really want to make sure that like you are engaged in something that you enjoy, not something that like you're not going to enjoy doing. So please be very mindful of what that looks like. What do you like to do? Like if you're not a runner, don't go out running, right? But find another sport that maybe you like. If you like to play soccer, play soccer, but keep that that favorite sport and that activity going as you're going through life. And the other thing is get plenty of rest and sleep. I know as you embark on going off to college, you're going to have a lot of nights where you're, you know, staying up late at night trying to finish different activities, right? Sometimes, you know, you do need to sleep and you do need to rest, because if not, anything that you're absorbing is not going to stay there. So I just remind everyone, in order to take care of yourself, you need to make sure that you're sleeping and you're resting, because if not, you're not going to be the greatest. And like I always tell people, like, unless you know, I ate and I slept, I'm not going to be nice to you sometimes, because I'm not in the mood for it, because my system is not where it needs to be, because I'm not feeling well. So the more you rest and the more you learn that rest is important, it's going to be beneficial. And I will be truthful, you know, when I was going to school, you know, I'd spend all-nighters, right? I'd start at 8 in the morning, I wouldn't finish, and 8 in the morning one day and finish at like, you know, 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning the next day. And, you know, that takes a toll on you to put that much effort into something. And while, you know, you crank it out, it's just not good on your body. And you can do it when you're younger, but as you start getting older, it just doesn't work that way. So procrastination and learning how you procrastinate and why you procrastinate is actually really, really important. The last part is learning to have a healthy diet. As you guys move on to college and move on to different, you know, areas of your life, one thing you're going to notice is that you have more access to different types of food, and sometimes you love that food and that food is great, but sometimes that food is not the best thing for you. So, I always remind people, eating hot, flaming hot Cheetos is not something that you want to do every day, but it might be something you want to do like once a month, right? And the only reason I say that is because the more you put stuff that's not the greatest in your body, while it's great at the beginning because you're all young, as you slowly start getting older, it's not going to be feeling the greatest for you. So just something to be mindful about. I'm not a dietitian, so I'm not going to tell people how to eat. I just like to remind people that when you eat healthy stuff, it actually makes you feel a little better. The other thing that I want you to also understand is practicing stress management, like relaxation techniques, yoga, meditation, guided imagery, or deep breathing and prayer. These are all important things, and the more you put that into your daily life, the more you can actually reduce some of the trauma impacts in your life, but also learn to check in with yourself and learn how everything is feeling. And the more you actually do this type of work, the more you're going to be able to really feel healthy. And I know they're in this workshops, they're offering yoga. Take advantage of it and actually test it out and see if it's something that you actually enjoy doing. But I really want to make sure that you guys all understand, like, these are just tips. You are allowed to create your own path of what taking care of yourself looks like, as long as it's something that's healthy. You don't want to get into the part where, you're doing unhealthy things and then feeling like that's going to actually help you, because sometimes people do things that are healthy or helpful that might not be, right? So I always give the example, like I've had youth come into my office and tell me, I smoke marijuana because it helps me be able to concentrate or helps me be able to eat. Well, that's great because it's a coping mechanism. It might not be a coping mechanism you want to keep forever, because substance use at the end of the day is something that keeps you away from being the best person who you are. So you might want to just be mindful of what that looks like for you, especially as you're going through these different journeys. And okay. So the other part to know is that while you're building your resilience, you're going to get really good at who you are and what it feels like, and just really be mindful about that. But I also want to make sure that you understand when something gets so overwhelmed. So this is the way I explain it is, if you've told your friend the same story 20 times, and by the 20th time, they're like, I just don't want to hear it anymore, you need to go tell someone else. That might be the best time to actually seek assistance and actually seek to speak to a therapist or somebody in the mental health, a mental health professional that can actually be able to take your story in and be able to help guide you. Because sometimes when we tell stories, we can tell a story on and on, and it might not actually be able to help us. So I just remind everyone about that, especially because it's really important that when you're not in the safest of spaces, that you're able to reach out and ask people what that looks like and how they can help you. I will also say this is that you have the power to become resilient. This is not something that you're going to learn from a book, but the power comes from being able to sit with yourself and know who you are. If you don't know who you are, you gotta do the work to figure out who you are and what you like and what you don't like, because that's actually one of the parts of resilience, is really acknowledging like who you are as a person and how you kind of live through this world, and what you want and what you don't. So I'm gonna, oops, sorry, I went too far, but I did want to ask, stop right here, because I did want to share before this other piece of just reminding everyone about a couple things. So I've told you a lot about trauma and how that impacts people, but I did want to tell you that as you're going on through this journey of going to school, you will blend with different people from different places. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen for a minute. You will blend with different people in different places, and when that happens, one of the things that you're going to notice is that your experience might not be other people's experience. And so when that happens, I really want you all to acknowledge that when that happens, sometimes for people, they tend to start feeling like there's these things that have come up for them. And so as you're going through your journey, similar to every single other person that's gone through this journey, I really want you to acknowledge that your experience, it might not be other people's experience, but you are still a resilient person. And so the more you're able to maneuver through those pieces, the easier it'll feel for you. And also just to be able to understand that, you know, resilience is not something that everyone has. Sometimes you're lucky enough that your parents have instilled it for you as you're going through life. Other people haven't had that. So sometimes you have to also do the work to get to know who you are so that you are able to maneuver the next step in your life. You know, and as someone who has had to maneuver, you know, through a lot of different journeys, I have a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, and I have a doctorate. So every single one of those experiences in school was so very different. And I learned a little bit about myself in each one of those different journeys. And so I remind you, as you're, you know, seeking higher education, be very mindful of, you know, how it is that things are going for you in your life. And I always remind everyone, it's really good to figure out like who you are as you're going through this. And don't take so much the part of like looking at things from a perspective of like, I'm so traumatized. Look at it from a perspective of, you know what, while all these things have happened to me, that those things are not who I am. And I'm willing to do the work for myself to be able to really find a resilient way to, you know, continue my life and teach other people about how to be resilient. So we do have, I think, a question, or I think there might be a question in the chat box. Okay, so sorry, I just saw this right now. So one of the things you should know about, I think someone asked about vicarious trauma. And I know I'm gonna switch back. Vicarious trauma is when, sorry, I think I have to go back to the slide, but let me find it. Let me share my screen again. I guess that might be easier. Okay. So vicarious trauma might look a little different to every single person, but what you might find is that vicarious trauma is actually the part where someone shares a story, and then that story actually can create trauma for you. So vicarious trauma is, you know, my best friend told me about, you know, about their story about, you know, their physical abuse, and, you know, I heard it and it hurt my heart, and it made me not feel the greatest about that situation. And so now I myself feel it as well. So I just remind everyone that vicarious trauma is when people share stories or, share stories with you, and then you take that along. But it's also for first responders, like for people that are working in this field, that are taking on those stories and that are impacted by them. So when we look at vicarious trauma, it could be like that part where, you know, someone tells you these stories quite often, but it's also for us as first responders of how we start taking on those symptoms of the people that we're working with, and we can take them home. So I always give the example, I once had someone I was working with, and they had a lot of different types of abuse that happened to them. And when I would go home, I would myself start feeling sad or upset about things. So that's vicarious trauma, when I start taking things on for myself. So I just remind everyone about what that looks like, and just like how that can be impactful for you. I'm going to stop right here and just ask if there's any other questions that anybody else might have, or any other things that I can share before we end today. Oh, okay. Nope, all good. And then Jane said that you can also type your question here and use your mic. So now it's an open mic. Sure, I'm more than happy to type my information in the chat box. And I hope I didn't traumatize you guys as talking about all this trauma. Oh, someone said it won't let you use your mic. I don't know if that's if people are stopped. Like
No,
if someone.
they can actually use it now.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think someone's maybe waiting or trying to use the mic. You can always type your question as well in the chat box. It says, I guess now it lets you use it. Okay. Oh, I think you might be muted, Susanna, if you're trying to speak.
It's okay. I was just I'm trying to get used to this because I don't use Zoom when I'm with my class, so I'm kind of confused.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Well, you're on now. If you had a question.
No, I think I got everything pretty clear. It was good.
Okay. Perfect. Happy to hear that. Anybody else have any other questions? No? Then I think we're good to end then. If you guys do have questions, my email address is also in the chat box. So if you later on have a question about something, you're more than welcome to feel free to go ahead and send it. I will also let everyone know as you guys kind of embark on your educational journeys, whichever way that journey goes, please always be mindful of every information you're gaining is something that you're taking with you. So, you know, learn as much as you can. And I hope you enjoyed our presentation. And that's about it.
Thank you, Narita.
Thanks.
We have another session starting in about 15 minutes. That is the My City, My Stories, the sustainability one. So you can hop on that one if you would like to. Thanks for joining us. And thank you for the health department and Narita for doing this presentation as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shane. All right. Bye, everyone.